Marcus Chen had never imagined that a peaceful morning spent casting his line into Crystal Lake would cost him $23,000 and change his life forever. But as he stood in his kitchen at 5:47 a.m., staring at the certified letter from the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, he realized that sometimes the most expensive lessons come disguised as simple pleasures. The letter, printed on cream-colored paper with the HOA's pretentious gold seal, informed him that he was being fined $500 for unauthorized recreational activities on community property and an additional $2,000 for failure to obtain proper permits for lakeside access. Marcus read it 3 times, each reading making his blood pressure spike a little higher. He'd been fishing that lake every weekend for 2 years, ever since he'd moved into the neighborhood, and nobody had ever said a word. Marcus wasn't the type of man who looked for trouble. At 42, he was a software engineer who preferred code to confrontation, debugging to drama. He'd bought his house in Willowbrook Estates specifically because it was quiet, well-maintained, and came with access to the beautiful 15-acre lake that served as the community's crown jewel. The real estate agent had specifically mentioned the fishing opportunities, calling it a angler's paradise right in your backyard. He grabbed his phone and called the HOA office, his hands trembling slightly with contained anger. The receptionist, a woman with a voice that sounded like she'd been sucking on lemons, informed him that the new regulations had been passed at the monthly board meeting he'd missed while visiting his sick mother in Portland. But nobody sent me notice of the meeting, Marcus protested. All residents are required to check the community bulletin board weekly for updates, came the robotic reply. Ignorance of new regulations is not grounds for fine reduction. Marcus drove to the lake that morning, not to fish, but to think. The sun was just breaking over the water, casting golden ripples across the surface where he'd caught his first bass in the neighborhood. He'd brought his 8-year-old nephew Tommy here just last month, watching the boy's eyes light up when he'd hooked a bluegill. The lake had become more than just a fishing spot. It was his sanctuary, his escape from the endless stream of code, reviews and client meetings that filled his workdays. As he stood there, watching a great blue heron wade through the shallows, Marcus noticed something that made his engineer's mind start working overtime. There was no signage anywhere around the lake indicating it was HOA-controlled property. No barriers, no gates, nothing to suggest it wasn't public land. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more he realized he'd never seen any documentation, proving the HOA actually owned the lake. That afternoon, Marcus did what any good engineer would do when faced with a problem. He researched. He spent 4 hours at the county assessor's office, pulling property records, survey maps, and historical documents. What he discovered made him smile for the first time since receiving that morning's letter. Crystal Lake wasn't HOA property at all. It was privately owned by something called the Crystal Lake Holdings Trust, established in 1987 by a man named Harold Fitzgerald, who'd apparently bought the land as an investment and then forgotten about it. According to the tax records, the trust had been paying property taxes faithfully for 37 years, but there was no indication that Fitzgerald or his heirs had ever done anything with the property. Marcus spent the next 3 days tracking down Harold Fitzgerald's family. It turned out Harold had died in 2019, leaving his modest estate to his daughter Sarah, who lived in Phoenix and worked as a dental hygienist. When Marcus called her, she was genuinely surprised to learn she owned a lake. Dad never mentioned it, Sarah told him over the phone. I just see this weird tax bill every year for some property in your town, and I pay it because, it was Dad's. But I've never even seen the place. Marcus asked if she'd ever given the HOA permission to manage the property or collect fees related to it. Sarah laughed. I've never heard of any HOA. As far as I know, it's just sitting there. That's when Marcus made the phone call that would change everything. He asked Sarah if she'd be interested in selling the lake. You want to buy a lake? She asked, incredulous. Yes, Marcus said, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. I want to buy your lake. The negotiation took less than a week. Sarah wanted $180,000 for the property, which Marcus's research had shown was actually undervalued given its size and location. She was thrilled to get rid of what she'd considered a tax burden, and Marcus was thrilled to become the owner of the body of water that had caused him so much trouble. While the paperwork was being processed, Marcus decided to do a little more, investigating into the HOA's activities around the lake. What he found made his jaw drop. The Willowbrook Estates HOA had been charging residents lake access fees for over 15 years, collecting what amounted to nearly $400,000 in fees for access to property they didn't own. They'd also been issuing fines for various lake-related infractions, generating additional revenue that went straight into their operating budget. Marcus realized he wasn't just buying a lake. He was potentially uncovering fraud on a massive scale. The day the deed transfer was finalized, Marcus drove to the lake with a bottle of champagne and a fishing rod. He'd become, according to the official property records, the sole owner of Crystal Lake and the 15 acres surrounding it. Every duck, every fish, every blade of grass along the shoreline now belonged to him. He cast his line into the water and waited. Within minutes, his phone started ringing. The caller ID showed it was Margaret Thornton, the president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA board and the woman who'd personally signed his original fine notice. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of authority that comes from years of micromanaging other people's lives. "I understand you've been spreading some very concerning rumors about lake ownership. I need to inform you that continuing to fish on HOA property after receiving an official violation notice constitutes trespassing, and we will be forced to involve law enforcement." Marcus smiled as he felt a tug on his line. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, beginning to reel in what felt like a decent-sized bass, "I have some very interesting news for you." "I don't have time for games, Mr. Chen." "The thing is," Marcus continued, his voice steady and calm, "I'm not trespassing. In fact, as of this morning, I own this lake. All of it. And I have the deed to prove it." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Marcus thought the call had dropped. Finally, Margaret's voice came back, but it had lost its authoritative edge. That's impossible. The HOA has managed this lake for 15 years. "Managed property you didn't own," Marcus replied, successfully landing the base and holding it up to admire in the afternoon sunlight. "Which, as I'm sure you'll discover when you consult with your legal team, is a very serious problem." Marcus spent the rest of that afternoon researching exactly what rights he had as the new property owner. What he discovered was beautiful in its simplicity. He could do whatever he wanted with his lake. He could charge admission, he could ban people, he could drain it and turn it into a parking lot if he felt like it. The HOA had no legal authority over his property whatsoever. But Marcus wasn't a vindictive man by nature. His first instinct was to simply post some signs clarifying ownership and continue fishing in peace. Maybe charge a small fee to help offset the property taxes and maintenance costs. He wasn't looking to punish the entire neighborhood for the HOA board's mistakes. That reasonable approach lasted exactly 3 days. On Thursday morning, Marcus arrived at the lake to find Margaret Thornton and 2 other board members waiting for him, along with a sheriff's deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Officer Patterson," Margaret announced dramatically. "This is the man I told you about. He's trespassing on HOA property and refuses to leave despite being officially notified of the violations." Marcus calmly pulled out his phone and showed Officer Patterson a photo of the recorded deed. "Officer, I'm Marcus Chen, and I'm the legal owner of this property. I have all the documentation in my car if you'd like to see it." Officer Patterson examined the deed photo, then looked at Margaret with the expression of a man who'd dealt with HOA disputes before and found them universally tedious. "Ma'am, if he owns the property, he's not trespassing." "That deed is obviously fraudulent," Margaret snapped. "The HOA has owned this lake since the community was established." "Then you'll need to take that up in civil court," Officer Patterson replied. "This isn't a criminal matter." He tipped his hat to Marcus and walked back to his patrol car, leaving the HOA board members standing awkwardly by the water's edge. That's when Margaret made the mistake that would seal her fate and transform Marcus from a peaceful software engineer into the neighborhood's most formidable enemy. "You think you're very clever, don't you?" she said, her face flushed with anger. "Well, Let me tell you something, Mr. Chen. Even if you somehow manage to steal this lake from the community, we'll make your life so miserable that you'll regret ever moving to Willowbrook Estates. We'll fine you for every blade of grass that's too long, every flower that's the wrong color, every car that stays in your driveway 5 minutes past the visitor limit. We'll make you wish you'd never heard of this neighbor. The fence went up on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, Marcus's phone had exploded with calls from panicked neighbors. "Marcus, what the hell is going on?" His next-door neighbor Dave practically shouted into the phone. "There's a crew putting up an 8-foot privacy fence around the entire lake." Marcus, who was sitting in his office reviewing the final invoices from Rivera Fencing Company, smiled as he watched the installation through his window. "Just protecting my investment." "Dave? Your investment? What are you talking about?" "I bought the lake, Dave, all of it. It's mine now." The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear Dave's coffee mug hit the floor and shatter. Within an hour, Marcus's doorbell was ringing constantly. First came Dave, then the Johnsons from across the street, then the Martinez family, and soon there was a small crowd gathered on his front lawn. Margaret Thornton arrived last, pushing through the group like she owned the sidewalk. "This is ridiculous," she announced to the assembled neighbors. "Mr. Chen is obviously having some kind of breakdown. The lake belongs to the community." Marcus stepped out onto his porch, holding a folder full of legal documents. "The lake belongs to me, Margaret. I have the deed, the survey, and the tax records to prove it. Would you like to see them?" "This is insane," said Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street. "We moved here specifically for lake access. Our kids have been fishing there since they were toddlers." "I understand your frustration," Marcus replied calmly, "but I'm not the one who created this situation. Your HOA has been charging you fees for 15 years to access property they never owned. They've collected nearly $400,000 from this neighborhood based on a lie." The crowd turned to look at Margaret, whose face was rapidly turning the color of a ripe tomato. That's completely false. The HOA has always managed the lake." Marcus pulled out a stack of papers. "Here's the original deed from 1987. Here's the tax payment history. Here's the certificate of sale I received last week. Would you like me to read them out loud?" Dave stepped forward, looking genuinely confused. "But Marcus, we're neighbors. We've had barbecues together. You taught my son how to tie fishing knots. Why would you fence us out?" Marcus looked at Dave, then at the other neighbors who were genuinely hurt and confused, and felt a pang of guilt. These weren't the people who'd threatened him or tried to fine him into submission. These were good people who'd been lied to by their own HOA. "Dave," Marcus said quietly, 3 days ago, Mrs. Thornton threatened to make my life miserable for daring to question the HOA's authority. She promised to fine me for every minor violation she could manufacture, to harass me until I left the neighborhood. She didn't want to find a reasonable solution. She wanted to bully me into submission." "Margaret, is that true?" Dave asked. Turning to the HOA president, Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "Mr. Chen was being completely unreasonable. He was spreading lies about property ownership and—" "The lies were yours, Margaret," Marcus interrupted. "Every lake access fee you collected, every fine you issued for lake violations, every threat you made about trespassing, all of it was based on property you didn't own." Amanda Rivera chose that moment to pull up in her BMW, stepping out with a briefcase and the confident stride of a woman who just filed some very interesting paperwork. The crowd parted as she approached Marcus's porch. "Good afternoon, Marcus. Ladies and gentlemen," she nodded to the assembled neighbors. "I'm Amanda Rivera, Mr. Chen's attorney. I wanted to let everyone know that we've just filed suit against the Willowbrook Estates HOA for fraud, conversion, and breach of fiduciary duty." Margaret's face went pale. "Fraud? That's ridiculous." Amanda smiled the kind of smile that had made her famous in property law circles. "Mrs. Thornton, collecting fees for property you don't own is textbook fraud. Threatening legal action based on fraudulent claims compounds the offense. And the damages—" She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick document. "Well, let's just say they're substantial." "How substantial?" Dave asked, apparently fascinated despite the situation. Between the fees illegally collected, the fines improperly issued, and punitive damages for the fraud, we're seeking just over $2 million, Amanda replied casually, as if she were discussing the weather. The crowd gasped. Margaret looked like she might faint. That's impossible, Margaret whispered. The HOA doesn't have that kind of money. Which is why we've also filed liens against the personal assets of the board members who participated in the fraud, Amanda continued cheerfully. That would include you, Mrs. Thornton, along with Mr. Bradley and Mrs. Chang. To other people in the crowd, Marcus recognized them as the other board members who'd confronted him at the lake, began backing away slowly, as if they could somehow escape their legal troubles by putting distance between themselves and Amanda. Marcus watched the fear spread across Margaret's face and realized he was enjoying this more than he probably should. The woman who'd threatened to make his life miserable was now facing the possibility of losing her house to pay for her own arrogance. There is, however, a way to resolve this amicably, Marcus announced, causing everyone to look at him hopefully. I'm prepared to grant lake access to neighborhood residents under certain conditions. What conditions? Dave asked quickly. Marcus pulled out a prepared list. First, the entire HOA board resigns immediately. Second, all illegally collected fees are returned to the residents who paid them. Third, the HOA issues a formal apology admitting their mistake. And fourth, I get a written guarantee that no further fines or violations will be issued against my property for any reason. And if we agree to those terms? Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Then I'll grant permanent lake access to all current residents at no charge, and I'll donate the property to the neighborhood upon my death or if I move away. The crowd began murmuring excitedly. It was a generous offer, more generous than many of them had expected after seeing the fence go up. But Margaret's pride wouldn't let her accept defeat gracefully. You can't just destroy our HOA because of one little misunderstanding. One little misunderstanding? Marcus's voice rose for the first time since the confrontation began. Margaret, you stole $400,000 from your neighbors. You issued fines with no legal authority. You threatened to harass me for exercising my property rights. This isn't a misunderstanding, it's systematic fraud. Amanda stepped closer to Margaret. Mrs. Thornton, I should mention that we've also referred this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. Fraud on this scale typically results in felony charges. Margaret looked around desperately at the crowd of neighbors, but found no sympathy in their faces. They'd just learned that their HOA had been lying to them for 15 years, and several of them were starting to calculate how much money they'd paid in illegitimate fees. How long do we have to decide? Dave asked Marcus. 72 hours, Marcus replied. After that, the offer expires and we proceed with the full lawsuit. The crowd began to disperse, neighbors clustering in small groups to discuss what they'd just heard. Margaret stood alone on the sidewalk, looking lost and defeated. As the last of the neighbors left, Amanda turned to Marcus. That was very generous of you. Most people in your situation would have just taken the money and run. Marcus looked out at the lake, where his new fence was casting long shadows across the water. These are good people, Amanda. They didn't know what their HOA was doing. Margaret and her cronies are the real problem. What if they don't accept your terms? Marcus smiled. Then I'll enjoy having the most private fishing spot in the county, and you'll enjoy a very lucrative lawsuit. The next 72 hours were the most chaotic in Willowbrook Estates history. Marcus watched from his window as neighbors went door to door, organizing meetings and circulating petitions. Someone had apparently done the math on the illegally collected fees, because by Thursday evening there was an angry crowd outside Margaret's house demanding answers. On Friday morning, Dave knocked on Marcus's door holding an official-looking document. We did it, he said, grinning broadly. Margaret, Bradley, and Chang all resigned. The whole board is gone, and we voted to accept your terms unanimously. Marcus looked at the resignation letters and the community agreement. Everything was exactly as he'd requested, signed by every household in the neighborhood. There's just one thing, Dave added, sheepishly. We were wondering if you'd consider joining the new HOA board. You know, to help us avoid this kind of mess in the future. Marcus laughed. Dave, I just spent a fortune to get away from HOA drama. Why would I want to volunteer for more? Because you're the only person in this neighborhood who's proven they can stand up to bullies and actually win. That afternoon, Marcus walked down to his lake and unlocked the gate he'd had installed in the fence. Word spread quickly, and soon families were arriving with fishing poles, picnic baskets, and grateful smiles. His nephew Tommy was the first to catch a fish from the new lake, a small bluegill that he insisted on releasing so it could grow up big and strong. Margaret Thornton put her house up for sale the following week. Word around the neighborhood was that she couldn't afford the legal fees, let alone the